Hello, everybody. I wanted to basically strike while the iron is hot with this. This is not my typical type of video, but I'd like to get into a discussion about something that was on my mind recently. So I was talking to my students about rationalizations, and I had heard this phrase, rationalization hamster. Basically, it's when somebody kind of gets into a loop, right? They don't want to get out of it, so they run like a hamster on a hamster wheel, right? They make rationalizations for things rather than facing up with what the actual problem is. And I had learned I had known the topic of what's called the Great Leap Forward, but I did not really read it so much. And the discussion prompted me to read it, and just my jaw was dropped to the floor. I couldn't believe what I had read, and mostly the reason I couldn't believe it was because I couldn't believe I wasn't taught this. I don't think it was emphasized in schools nearly enough. You know, schools completely emphasize that really, really bad man in 1940s Germany, but they don't really emphasize a lot of other major events in human history, and I think that this is a good one. See, I knew about the Great Leap Forward in its basics, I should say. I did know that it was something that Mao had tried to do when he was in charge of communist China, and I do know that it was disastrous, but I did not really realize the extent of it until I started searching into it, and I wanted to kind of share that with you guys now because I could not believe it. So basically speaking, we are all very familiar with that very, very bad guy from Germany, right? What do we know about him? What can everybody say about him? He was a very evil man. He killed many people. Most especially, he's the one directly responsible for the Holocaust, which cost, again, the estimates are typically 6 million Jewish lives. Very, very bad. But the more I learned about the Great Leap Forward, and the more I learned about Mao, oh my God, Mao is way, way worse. And it fit perfectly with that discussion I had with my students about rationalizations. You see, like, the reason we really don't like that bad guy from Germany is because he exhibits all of those outward characteristics of an evil tyrant, right? He killed many, many people. And those were basically war deaths. He was like trying to kill them. Mao, on the other hand, through his bungling incompetence and through his complete inability to just acknowledge that what he was trying to do wasn't working, he was so much worse. So we're going to get into it now, and I've got the Wikipedia article brought up just so we can go through the basics. I'm sure that you history buffs out there know a lot more. I'm just learning this, but again, what I learned dropped my jaw. Okay, so let's just go over the basics. The Great Leap Forward was an economic social ed campaign from 1958 to 1962. Chairman Mao Zedong launched a campaign to reconstruct the economy from an agrarian economy into a communist society. Okay? Mao decreed increased efforts to multiply grain yields and bring industry to the countryside. Local officials were fearful of anti-rightist campaigns and competed to fulfill or over-fulfill quotas based on Mao's exaggerated claims, collecting surpluses that in fact did not exist and leaving farmers to starve. Higher officials did not dare report the economic disaster caused by these policies, and national officials, blaming bad weather for the decline in food output, took little or no action. The Great Leap Forward resulted in tens of millions of deaths, with estimates ranging between 15 and 55 million, making the Great Chinese Famine the largest in human history. Now let's just stop right there. Well, you see exactly the point that I was making. And I think it's very, very important for people to just kind of sit down and think about this. Whenever you have these revolutionary ideas, these revolutionary people trying to make this perfect world, the problem is it gets smacked down by reality. And then you're on the rationalization hamster wheel. Are you going to admit that your policies don't work, or are you just going to keep on doing them even if it leads to deaths, even if it leads to terrible things. And just in brief, that's why Mao was so much worse than that bad German man who I don't want to name because I don't want to get this video downgraded in any way. But in either case, look at that. Estimates ranging between 15 and 55 million deaths. That's unbelievable. And we just don't seem to emphasize it, do we? We hear many, many times about 6 million deaths of the Holocaust, about how horrible that was. Why does nobody say the same thing about the Great Leap Forward? The minimal estimates are 2.5 times the Holocaust. Those are the minimal estimates. The maximal, the 55 million, are just, it's beyond comprehension. I didn't know this about Mao. I had no idea that he's such a bad guy. And if you didn't know about this, let's go through this article because it gets worse. Chief changes in the lives of rural people included incremental production of mandatory agricultural collectivization. Private farming was prohibited, and those who engaged in it were persecuted and labeled counter-revolutionaries. Restrictions on rural people were enforced through public struggle sessions. Struggle sessions, by the way, really, really horrible things. Basically shaming people in public, trying to put pressure on them to, confess to like crimes that weren't really crimes. Anyway, struggle sessions and social pressure, although people also experienced forced labor. Rural industrialization, while officially a priority in the campaign, saw its development aborted by the mistakes of the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap was one of two periods between 1953 and 1976 in which China's economy shrank. Economist Dwight Perkins argues that enormous amounts of investment produced only modest increases in production or none at all. In short, the Great Leap was a very expensive disaster. In 1959, Mao Zedong ceded day-to-day leadership to pragmatic moderates like Li Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, and the CCP studied the damage done at conferences in 1960 and 1962, especially at the 7,000 Cadres Conference. Mao did not retreat from his policies. I'll say that again. Mao did not retreat from his policies, and instead blamed problems on bad implementation and rightists for opposing him. He initiated the socialist education movement in 1963 and the Cultural Revolution in 1966 in order to remove opposition and reconsolidate his power. In addition, dozens of dams constructed in Zhumadane, Henan during the Great Leap Forward collapsed in 1975 under the influence of Typhoon Nina and resulted in one of the greatest man-made catastrophes in history, with an estimated death toll between tens of thousands to 240,000. Now, this is just the basics. We're going to dig into it a little bit deeper, but do you see what I mean? The reason that Mao is such a monster is because he just wouldn't admit that he was wrong. Say what you will about that bad German guy. He's a very, very bad man, of course. But when it's time to admit that you're wrong, you have to admit that you're wrong. And that apparently creates a much, much worse monster. Okay, so I'm not going to go every single line by every single line, but I wanted to emphasize a lot of the points that lead back to the central theme of making terrible decisions and then simply not admitting that they're terrible decisions, right? And just, continuing to do them no matter what it costs somebody else. So hopefully you can be able to see, what was happening, during those times. They were trying to collectivize farming. And when you do that, when you collectivize farming, at least at this time period in history, it just didn't work well. People didn't really know how to do them efficiently. And so there were shortfalls. These reforms were generally unpopular with peasants, usually implemented by summoning them to meetings, making them stay there for days, sometimes weeks, until they quote-unquote voluntarily agreed to join the collective. I mean, if there's one good thing that I can find in this, it says attempts were made to enhance rural education and the status of women, allowing them to initiate divorce if they desired, ending foot binding, child marriage, and opium addiction. But again, there's a price to pay for those kind of things. Highest priority was given to the urban proletariat, for whom a welfare state was created. Okay, the 100 Flowers campaign and the anti-rightist campaign. In 1957, Mao responded to the tensions of the party by promoting free speech and criticism under the 100 Flowers campaign. However, if you click on it and find out what the 100 Flowers campaign is, it was a period in 1956 to 57 during which the Communist Party encouraged citizens to express openly their opinions of the communist regime. So it sounds like it was great. However, really, all it boiled down to was people who would speak out against it. Basically, they identified themselves as rightists, and then they were subsequently attacked. Okay, so the idea behind it, according to Mao, the policy of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend is designed to promote the flourishing of the arts and the progress of science. Okay, however, the result of it was citizens were rounded up in waves by the hundreds of thousands, publicly criticized, condemned to prison camps for re-education through labor or even execution. Okay, so even though apparently it was supposed to be a campaign to let people express how they really felt, when they did, they painted targets on their faces. Okay, so this is one of the worst parts of the plan. The whole idea was to make farms collectivized and to make industry industrialized. And it was to outcompete other countries, right? So there was a basic system where it said China had wanted to catch up with and surpass the United Kingdom in 15 years. So again, that was what they wanted to do, but they had such terrible ways of doing it. With no personal knowledge of metallurgy, Mao encouraged the establishment of small backyard steel furnaces in every commune and in each urban neighborhood. Mao was shown an example of a backyard furnace in September 1958. This unit was claimed to be manufacturing high-quality steel. Okay, so he would have people make backyard furnaces, okay, in which they would try to make steel. However, although the output consisted of low-quality lumps of pig iron, which was of negligible economic worth, Mao had a deep distrust of intellectuals who could have pointed this out, and instead placed his faith in the power of the mass mobilization of the peasants. Moreover, the experience of the intellectual classes following the 100 Flowers campaign silenced those aware of the folly of such a plan. According to his private doctor, Mao and his entourage visited traditional steelworks in Manchuria in January 1959, where he found out that high-quality steel could only be produced in large-scale factories using reliable fuel such as coal. However, he decided not to order a halt to the backyard steel furnaces so as not to dampen the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. The program was only quietly abandoned much later in the year. And there you see it. He knew it was a failure. He knew it didn't do anything, but he continued down a path that he knew didn't work. Irrigation. Substantial effort was expended upon the Great Leap Forward on a large scale, but too often in the form of poorly planned capital construction projects, such as irrigation works built without input from trained engineers. Mao was well aware of the human cost of these water conservancy campaigns. In early 1958, while listening to a report on irrigation, he mentioned that, and this is a quote, "Wu Zhipu claims he can move 30 billion cubic meters. I think 30,000 people will die. Zheng Zisheng has said that he will move 20 billion cubic meters, and I think that 20,000 will die. WAYYY only promises 600 million cubic meters. Maybe nobody will die." Though Mao criticized the excessive use of corvée for large-scale water conservancy projects in late 1958, mass mobilization on irrigation works continued unabated for the next several years, and claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of exhausted, starving villagers. The inhabitants of Jingshui and Gansu referred to these projects as the killing fields. Okay, there's many things that we can talk about as far as treatment of villagers, hunger, labor camps, and again, all these things are there to deny reality, to deny the fact that policies are just not working as they should be. Okay, so what happened to some of the people, some of the peasants? Frank Decoder writes that the beatings with sticks was the most common method used by local cadres, and roughly half of all cadres regularly pummeled or caned people. Other cadres devised harsher means to humiliate and torture people, or torture those who failed to keep up. As mass starvation set in, even greater violence had to be inflicted in order to coerce malnourished people to labor in the fields. Victims were burned alive, thrown bound into ponds, stripped naked and forced to labor in the middle of winter, doused in boiling water, forced to ingest excrement and urine, subjected to mutilation, hair ripped out, noses and ears lopped off. In Guangdong, some cadres injected salt water into their victims with needles normally reserved for cattle. Around 6 to 8% of those who died during the Great Leap Forward were tortured to death or summarily killed. Benjamin Valentino notes that communist officials sometimes tortured and killed those accused of failing to meet their grain quota. The Lushan Conference. The initial impact of the Great Leap Forward was discussed at the Lushan Conference in August 1959. Although many of the more moderate leaders had reservations about the new policy, the only senior leader to speak out openly was Marshal Peng Dehuai. Mao responded to Peng's criticism of the Great Leap by dismissing Peng from his post as defense minister, denouncing Peng, who came from a poor peasant family, and his supporters as bourgeois, and launching a national campaign against rightist opportunism. Peng was replaced by Lin Biao, who began a systematic purge of Peng's supporters from the military. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. There are some people who just use words for power. They really do not care in the least about reality. So you have this marshal who is trying to speak up against it, trying to criticize this Great Leap Forward. And then what does Mao do? Person from a poor peasant family, oh, you're bourgeois. Does that sound familiar? People in modern day using words, calling people names if they don't agree with their policies, even if their policies are really, really bad. All these lessons, they're right there in stark contrast for us to learn. And some of these graphs make it very, very clear. The birth rate in China versus the death rates, the time of the Great Leap Forward, it's very clear. Okay, there was a big spike in the global number of deaths, okay, because so many had starved to death in China during that time. I mean, the consequences were very, very clear. And yet, what did Mao do? It wasn't my fault, it was something else. It wasn't my fault, it was this. So, I understand very much why people hate a monster like Hitler, because he's very easy to blame, right? He's the kind of monster who aggressively goes after his enemies. But it makes at least some sort of sense, right? He's going after people that he hated, and he's attacking them with straight-up military force. Mao, his attack came from his bungling policies. He was trying to bring China forward. He was trying to bring collectivization, industrialization. He was trying to bring this great economic prosperity to China. He wanted to save them, but he didn't let a inconvenient thing like reality get in the way. I didn't know about this, and it blew me away to read about these things. And it also continues to blow me away that not many people know about it. When I mentioned this to my students, literally 2 students out of 15 had even heard about it. And they were not totally knowledgeable. They were something like me. They maybe heard of it, but they didn't really know what it was, what it meant. But there you go. This is just one of those things I learned about recently. I kind of wanted to get off my chest. I had no idea about the danger of a revolutionary guy like Mao. I had heard his name many times, mentioned in some of the worst people, but I didn't know why. And then I learned more about it, and oh my God, this guy really is worse, okay, in many ways than that big bad man from Germany. One last little edit. I wanted to kind of put together a small summary of our discussion. This comes after the main video. So that evil German man is very, very easy to not like, right? Because whenever you see him, he's always jabbing his fingers, and he's got a big glare on his face. It's really easy to hate him, right? Because he gives off all the indicators of a dictator. Jabbing fingers, pointing at his enemies. Whereas Mao, you always see his pictures, and he's always got this goofy grin on his face. he doesn't look like he's capable of surviving 5 minutes on a battlefield. So I think that people tend to underestimate him as a villain, right? And his goal was not to set out to destroy his people, but he destroyed many, many more than Hitler did. In fact, by factors of, several times that amount, because of his bungling ways and because he would not let go of his perfect, utopian vision of what the future should be. And it turns out that can do a lot more damage. So I think that was something that we should really at least think about. It seems that we don't think about it enough, or we don't emphasize enough how much damage, how much of a monster a person can be without necessarily trying to be. But that's the price of not acknowledging reality. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. And if you know anything that would be of interest on the topic, I'd like to hear it. 見てくれてありがとうございます。さよなら。